Hi guys, Tom Barclay here. I'm going to do a video about Ange Postecoglou's first 50 Premier League games in charge of Tottenham Hotspur. Been so many memories, some good, some not so good. A lot of entertaining football, some disappointing results along the way, but definitely a lot of unforgettable moments. So I'm going to pick my three best wins or best matches, my three most disappointing matches, and my three most memorable. There'll be a bit of crossover between those best wins and memorable, but I'll pick three different ones for each of them. So we'll come to that. But just before I start, obviously a lot to choose from in those 50 games, just looking at a few stats. So 26 wins, 7 draws, he doesn't draw very often, and 17 defeats. So obviously there's been a fair few, as all Spurs fans will know, disappointing results along the way, but been some great ones too. 101 goals overall, which is only bettered, I think, by City, who had 118, Liverpool 110, and Arsenal 112. And bear in mind, this season, Ange Postecoglou's Tottenham is the highest scoring team in the Premier League at the moment. It shows they're getting better on that front. 74 goals conceded and 85 points overall, which I know when we were comparing Jurgen Klopp's first 50 games at Liverpool and Mikel Arteta's first 50 Premier League games at Arsenal, he's kind of wedged in between there. I think Arteta had 73 points and Klopp had 92, 85 for Ange. So yes, there have been some moments which have led to some doubt from some sections of the fan base, but I'd like to think after that Man City performance, which may come up in this, that may have dampened down a little bit, and it shows that he's, as long as he kicks on from here, it's actually been a pretty promising start from a points return point of view, and definitely some entertaining matches to enjoy along the way. So let's start. So I'm going to start off with my best three matches, and this is hard, and I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of fans who will who may disagree on certain choices. There is a lot to pick from on all of this, but the first one I'm going to go with for my best, one of my top three, in no particular order, is Tottenham 2, Liverpool 1 on September 30th last year. The reason I picked this game is mainly because of the unbelievable finish to it, with the goal going in the sort of 95th minute when Joel Matip's turned into his own net. And I remember being at that game and thinking it was during this amazing start for Spurs, but Liverpool felt like the first real massive challenge, I guess along with Arsenal away. But Liverpool were going well under Klopp at the time, not as well as they are going under Slot at the moment, but it was a real test for Postecoglou's Spurs. I remember in the build-up to it, a lot of it was about Postecoglou's history with Liverpool, because he was a boyhood Liverpool fan. At that point, we were still absolutely obsessed with his unique backstory and the fact that we didn't know much about him and the route he'd taken to get to Tottenham. Obviously, that story is well known now, but that was a big part of it. And the way he, back in Australia when he was a kid and there was hardly anything on TV, he used to get all the magazines, days late, and recorded stuff, matches in the middle of the night or any highlights he could get his hands on, and the Liverpool players that he idolised. But yeah, that win in particular, I mean, Liverpool did have two men sent off, it has to be said. So, I mean, maybe people will think other performances were more convincing. One of my mates is a Liverpool fan and still to this day believes Curtis Jones shouldn't be sent off for that foul on Basuma, and thought it was a classic case of it looking worse when slowed down on camera. I didn't think so. I thought it was a red card. But obviously I'm not the only one. There are other people who seem to disagree. Jota obviously got sent off for 2 quick yellows as well, I seem to remember. So, Spurs were given a helping hand, but Liverpool actually defended brilliantly with 9 men and almost came away with a point. But it was Spurs who won the day with that Matip goal. So maybe not the most sort of convincing of all performances, but one that I will never forget, and felt like a real big part, if not the most standout moment maybe of that brilliant start of the unbeaten 10 games to begin with. It did also come with controversy, didn't it? Because not just that red card, if you found that controversial with Jones, but the goal that was disallowed for Luis Diaz, I believe at 0-0, where the VAR thought it wasn't offside, but they thought they were confirming that it wasn't offside, and the on-pitch ref thought they were confirming that it was offside, and it was a whole to-do. But to be honest, at the time, people didn't really notice. It was only afterwards when that emerged, when the PGMOL held their hands up, that it became a huge thing, and it was definitely one of the biggest flare-ups from VAR, biggest controversies last season. But yeah, that was one of my three. The next one was a game that I was at as well. It was Aston Villa 0, Tottenham 4. There have been some convincing wins. And to be honest, the first half they weren't great against Villa, but just the way Spurs turned it on in the second half, goals from James Maddison, Brennan Johnson, Son and Timo Werner in the 90th minute, was just a pretty devastating and blistering second half performance. Villa didn't help themselves with John McGinn, their captain, who's generally, I don't think, quite a dirty player and actually one of the best people to talk to after a game from a journalist point of view. He's really, really erudite and a nice guy. He got sent off for what I think is a pretty uncharacteristic kick out at a doggy. It was a very sort of crazy tackle, really, and rightly sent off. And that obviously helped Spurs in that particular game. But in the lead up to that match, I think Villa were 5 points clear, and if they'd won, which a lot of people were predicting, it would have been 8 points, and that would have been top four pretty much over. Although we were during this period where Ange kept sort of bizarrely kind of playing down the significance of finishing in the top four, whether it meant anything or not. And obviously they won, cut it back to 2 points. And I remember Ange afterwards saying how people had written us off, saying we were dead if it was do or die, but we're not. I assume we're not dead yet. And it was a really convincing performance. Obviously we know they went on to miss out on top four to Villa. After a run of bad defeats that followed that game. But at that time, it was a pretty spectacular victory. That's my dog at the moment, just barking in the background. Maybe I'll edit this out, we'll see. Can you stop, please? No, let's just carry on. Let's go. And that brings me on to obviously the top win of all of them has to be Man City 0, Tottenham 4. The most recent game, but an unbelievable victory. That has sent shockwaves throughout the Premier League and really got Postecoglou back on track. Because let's remember, at this point, they just lost to Ipswich, which may also coming up, and quite a few fans were getting frustrated with where Ange was at and where Tottenham were at, and some were even calling for a change. And then they go to Man City, who obviously had been on a bad run, started by Spurs in the League Cup, 3 defeats in a row, but no one saw this. City hadn't lost at home for, I think, 52 games in a row. They're just unheard of that they go and lose at home, let alone getting absolutely battered 4-0. And I know it's got worse for them since, but this was a blistering victory. James Maddison was at the heart of it, his birthday, 28th birthday that day, but he hadn't even been in the team. He comes back into the side, Kulusevski gets pushed wide, and a tactical sort of masterstroke from Postecoglou, and he scores 2 excellent goals, excellent finishes, which led to this. And remember Pedro Porro's goal. It's obviously easy to remember. It was only a week ago or so, but Porro's goal for 3-0 really killed off the game completely, and then Brennan Johnson scores right in the 90th minute. But Pep afterwards held his hands up, talked about how fragile City were, and it was more of a narrative from a national point of view about what's happening to City. But from Spurs' point of view, they fully deserved it, as Pep pointed out, and they were excellent. And I think it was a statement win, which can hopefully be the launch pad. Or springboard, I guess, for more success, or for success for Ange going forward. But I suppose the whole point is how inconsistent they've been, and we'll see where they go from here. But definitely the standout victory and one of the most memorable moments. But it won't make it into my memorable moments just purely from repetition, so that's why it won't be in there. But unbelievable win. Honourable mentions. There's a lot. I mean, I think it was his first win when he beat Man United 2-0. That was a really big victory because he suddenly went for a back four. Porro was playing right back, and we thought, wow, he's going full Ange here. It seemed very risky given how Porro had performed in a back four in the back end of the last season when he really struggled. But that was a very convincing win. The draw, not a win, but a draw up at City with Kulusevski's last minute header. That was when City were going well. That was a really, really big performance. The 4-1 win over Newcastle. Newcastle looked a bit dead on their feet, to be fair, but Spurs were really purring at that point. Really, really good. And then this season, that 3-0 win at Man United, in the sort of dying days, I guess, of Ten Hag, to be fair. So I don't know how much credit you give to that, but any time you go and win 3-0 at Old Trafford has got to be looked on as a fantastic result. And there are others that people might point out, and I'd like to hear them in the comments. Let's move on to the worst three. I've got Brighton 4, Tottenham 2. I remember being at this. It was December 28th, almost about 11 months ago, just after Christmas last year. And Spurs had been going well, but this was the first real thumping I thought they got. I mean, 4-2 kind of flatters Tottenham. And bizarrely, in the last 10 minutes, they had chances to even make it 4-3 and even 4-4. But they were 4-0 down at one point, and were really, really struggling against De Zerbi's side at the time. De Zerbi, when his stock was really, really high, things changed from there, from his point of view. But that's a Brighton story. Hinchelwood scored their early goal. Joao Pedro got two penalties. And then Estupiñán, who hadn't played for ages, who's a really good player, scored an absolute worldie, I think, for 3-0. And yes, there were a couple of goals late from the lesser-spotted Alejo Veliz, I think scoring his first goal and only goal for Tottenham. And Ben Davies as well. Remember, Spurs were out with their two first-choice centre-backs at this point, Van der Ven and Romero. So there were sort of caveats, but it just really felt like the honeymoon period, I suppose, for Ange, when it was going so well, was well and truly over with that defeat. Just a real thumping with 11 men. I suppose the key is, obviously they lost to Chelsea, and that may come up later. But that was with 9 men, wasn't it? So it's quite a different situation. Whereas Brighton really took Spurs apart, and you sensed a sort of fragility that you hadn't really seen so much in a Postecoglou Spurs side until then, which was something that would crop up quite a lot towards the end of the season, and is why there are still some doubters out there. But that was a poor performance, and to move on to the next one, this is the next sort of this is one of those defeats that would come later in the season that I just referenced. Newcastle 4, Tottenham 0. I wasn't at this game. I don't generally go to the really north ones these days because we'll have guys up there covering it for the Sun. So I wasn't at this game. Maybe I'll try and do a trip up to Tyneside. It's always good fun. At least it's a great city. Not so much great for Spurs these days. Obviously they've played them already this season. But anyway, April the 13th. This was the start of 4 defeats in a row, which basically kiboshed Tottenham's chances of finishing in the top 4. Admittedly, they were against good teams. Newcastle have got some great players on the day, as Alexander Isak proved. He's an absolute top-class striker. Anthony Gordon's England international starter now, and then Fabian Schär is a very a good goal-scoring centre-back. So I guess no complete shame in losing to Newcastle, but it was the manner of the defeat. After that came Arsenal, Chelsea and Liverpool, which they lost to all of those. They're good sides. It was a tough run, but they did flounder in that run. They didn't really deserve to finish top 4 because of the way they handled that particular period. But it was all started by this Newcastle game. Weirdly, Spurs actually had quite a lot of chances and played quite well, which is not, I say weird, it's actually pretty standard for an Ange Postecoglou defeat, apart from some of the more recent ones like Palace, like Ipswich. But in this game, Timo Werner, unlike Isak with his sort of how clinical he was, Werner missed a couple of good chances, and that was when Ange afterwards was talking about a lack of conviction from his forward players, which has definitely been a recurring bit of commentary from him on his side, even this season, a lack of conviction, and yeah, that was a pretty terrible defeat. And then the other one I'm going to go for is the Ipswich game very recently. So Spurs 1, Ipswich 2 on November the 10th, so not long ago this month, or in November, and it was just a really poor defeat against a team who hadn't won all season in the Premier League, who had some good players, but a team that Spurs definitely should be looking to win. And I think it was the manner of the defeat. They obviously conceded 2 goals in the first half, gave themselves a mountain to climb with Sammy Smoldick's overhead kick and Liam Delap scoring, are both good players. But even though Bentancur did manage to get a goal back, a header in the second half for what end up being his last league performance for a while due to his ban, Tottenham didn't really deserve anything out of the game, and that was unlike the Newcastle game the previous season, where they were creating chances. That was quite worrying, and at that point, that's where it started to ramp up from any sort of dissension from the Spurs fans towards Postecoglou, but mainly because of the back end of the last season and defeats like at Palace, where they lost 1-0, which could definitely have easily been in here. Brighton 3-2, which could definitely have been in here for the manner of the way they collapsed in the second half. That was a bad moment. And when you looked at the fixtures coming up, City next away, you were starting to fear for him a little bit. And obviously we know what happened with City, which I already referenced. Honourable mentions, I already said those couple of games, Brighton 3-2 against Spurs, Palace 1-0 was really, really poor. Maybe that's the worst of the lot. Maybe we might go for that one. I haven't picked it, but could easily have. 3-2 at home to Arsenal. They were 3-0 down at one point in that game. Some struggling with set pieces. That whole set piece narrative. Obviously, North London derby's never good. That was poor. Chelsea away. Just before that actually, when they were 2-0, and I've never seen Ange that angry on the touchline when he was raging at his team when they were losing 2-0. Well, they ended up losing 2-0 at Stamford Bridge. That was a bad defeat against Pochettino's Chelsea. That could have been in there. There are others. It's been a mixed bag at times under Postecoglou, but it's always been fascinating from a journalist's point of view and a neutral's point of view to cover it. But I can see how infuriating or frustrating some of these results have been, both for the team, for the manager, and the supporters. So those are my three worst ones. So let's go on to my most memorable. Most memorable. I'm going to start with Tottenham 2, Sheffield United 1. September the 16th, just before the Liverpool game. So for Liverpool, I went for one of my best wins was Liverpool, but this could have easily been in there. Yes, the opposition are lesser, and that's probably why I haven't gone for it. But this was an unbelievable moment, which I will never forget, where Tottenham recorded the latest comeback, I think, in Premier League history. We were during this time where there were obviously VAR was making games go on longer and longer, and we're having more and more injury time. But Sheffield United were proving to be a real thorn in Spurs' side, really making them a real tough nut to crack. Two cliches right there for you. They obviously took the lead through Gustavo Hamer on 73 minutes, and it looked like this amazing start that Postecoglou had overseen was going to come to a juddering halt. But then on comes Richarlison, who's had his struggles throughout his time at Tottenham, mainly due to injury. But this was definitely a moment that he will look back with pride. He came off the bench, and remember, this was the week when he was talking about how he was going to seek psychological help, the problems he'd been having off the pitch, the split with his long-term advisor causing him issues. But he came off the bench. He scores a header in like the 8th minute of injury time to level the game, and then he tees up this Kulusevski brilliant strike with, I think, his weaker right foot. So it was a brilliant sort of counter-attack. I seem to remember even Perisic being part of it. And this was before Perisic got injured and obviously left. But he at the time was being quite useful as an option off the bench in the attacking wide left position. But yeah, just that goal going in, he had to feel for Paul Heckingbottom at the time, Sheffield United. He didn't last much longer in that job, and that felt like a key moment. But just the peak, perhaps, of up there with the Liverpool game for the atmosphere after the match, the way the fans carried the team, the way the love for Postecoglou. This was during the time where we'd have all those "I'm loving Big Ange instead" Robbie Williams covers after games. That interestingly they've disappeared this season, haven't they? We don't hear them anymore, despite even if there's a good win. But at that time, it was sort of really a halcyon time for Tottenham in that beginning, and yeah, could never forget that particular game. But the last two, I think, are more memorable for different reasons. They both aren't wins for Spurs, unfortunately, but they are just huge moments, really, in recent Premier League history, not just for Spurs, but for the Premier League overall. So the first one has to be Tottenham 1, Chelsea 4, November the 6th, 2023. Just the most mental game I've ever been to. Tottenham started brilliantly, to be fair, against Pochettino's return. That was the big build-up to the game. Back at Tottenham, but as Chelsea manager, how was it going to go? He'd obviously had a pretty ropey start generally at Chelsea, and Spurs fans had been calling for Pochettino's return in the sort of dying days of Conte. Instead, Postecoglou had turned up. Instead, Spurs make a great start. Kulusevski breaks the deadlock for 1-0. And then from there, it just goes completely pear-shaped. Spurs have Romero rightly sent off for a crude challenge on his compatriot Enzo Fernandez, and how he reacted in the aftermath. And then Palmer scored. That was for a penalty, which Cole Palmer, at that point, we didn't quite realise how ice cold Cole Palmer was. But he sticks away the penalty, makes it 1-1. And then Udogie gets sent off for two sort of reckless fouls, really, 2 yellows. on 55 minutes, and suddenly Tottenham down to 9 men. But unlike Liverpool, who'd had 9 men at Spurs not that long before and had put in this brilliantly resolute defence of 8 outfield players and almost come away with a point, Spurs just keep going for it and stick with this high line that just seemed like madness at the time. And eventually it did for them. Nicholas Jackson, who at that point was missing chances left, right and centre, ends up with a hat-trick. But it doesn't tell the whole story because, first of all, Spurs have got major injuries, which would prove to be way more influential on their season than this one-off result in James Maddison, who was absolutely flying at that point and has never really been as good since, albeit it was great against Man City. So fingers crossed he can return to that kind of form. And crucially, Van der Ven, who ended up being the player of the season, a brilliant signing from Wolfsburg, but he comes off with a hamstring injury, potentially caused or maybe not caused, but had a knock-on effect to that injury by the amount of VAR time the players on a very cold night, remember it was that night, standing around because of VAR taking ages over various decisions. And I would not be surprised if that hamstring went as a result of that. But anyway, those players got injured, and that kind of decimated Spurs' season to a certain extent and led to a lot of these poor results that came later. But Spurs kept going for it, which seemed like a crazy approach, but it almost paid off. Remember Eric Dyer put the ball in the net with a brilliant finish, and it was ruled, I think, offside. And then Son was through and could have scored, could have made it 2-2 in the 90th minute. And then it was Jackson who scored a couple of goals after that to inflict a pretty damaging scoreline. But it was just a crazy game. Postecoglou afterwards was probably having a go at VAR. He's not a fan generally, but went down that route again. But a game that will always stick in the memory. And then finally, has to be Tottenham 0, Man City 2, May the 14th, penultimate game of the season. Just, if Chelsea was a bizarre on-pitch situation, the 4-1, this one was, the lead up to it was unique. I haven't seen it before, where basically Arsenal are in the box seat to win the title if Spurs can go and beat City. Lots of fans for Tottenham don't want that to happen, would rather see their team lose. Postecoglou doesn't really believe that, but it does seem to genuinely be the case that they couldn't stomach Arsenal winning the title or handing the title to Arsenal. The pre-match press conference ahead of the game, Postecoglou's basically having none of it, and is kind of lashes out a little bit towards that mentality. The game comes along. Spurs have got some injuries. He actually changes it up in a rare sort of tactical tweak from his point of view, where Sarr plays false 9, and they're playing really well. They end up losing 2-0, Haaland scoring both, but they're 1-0, City are 1-0 up towards the last few minutes of the game. Son is running through, and most of the time you back him to stick it away. He can't beat Ortega, and City then get a penalty in stoppage time, and Haaland finishes off the game. But you couldn't help thinking Son, an icon really of Tottenham Premier League history. You got to wonder at that moment, is it going through his mind, if I score this, how is this going to go down if it ends up handing Arsenal a title? Just a really bizarre atmosphere. If I'm right, that was the game afterwards where Ange talks about fragile foundations at the club. Yeah, I think it was, in a very feisty post-match press conference. And to be honest, at that point, it felt like he didn't quite judge the mood of a lot of fans rightly, even though people can understand he's a winner, he wants to win, all he cares about is that. He doesn't come with the history of the North London rivalry. And it felt like there was a bit of a fraying of that relationship, which had been so close between him and the supporters up until that point. And maybe that's part of why some of the pressure that's come on him since. But anyway, that particular game was just unreal. A bizarre situation that definitely goes down as one of the most unforgettable in Postecoglou's 50 games and in Premier League history, to be honest. So anyway, 50 games down, 51 is up this weekend. And to be honest, I'm very much enjoying this Postecoglou tenure. The games are so entertaining. There's so many games to pick from for just the highlights, let alone every other match. So here's the next 50.